thank you so much for joining today for our mid-legislative session check-in. Really grateful to have you here. As I'm sure you saw, we are recording this webinar as a heads up. And my name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. And VCV is an organization that works to advocate for strong environmental laws, hold lawmakers accountable using tools like our environmental scorecard, and we help elect pro-environment lawmakers. And we thought it was a great time to do a legislative update and overview because we just passed through crossover time, which is the time of year when bills typically need to pass either the House or Senate to stay viable for the year. So we have a really good idea of what's moving and has momentum and what has likely stalled out for this year. And I'm excited to report that there are a lot of environmental priorities still in play this year. We've seen some great momentum on climate action, clean water, conservation investments, environmental justice, holding polluters accountable, and smart growth and healthy forest policies. So I'll take just a few minutes to share some perspectives on some of the broader context that I hope can help just kind of frame up what we're seeing at the State House this year. Then you're going to hear from some policy experts from my colleagues at the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So big picture, why are we succeeding on a number of environmental initiatives so far this year? For one thing, we have leadership in the House and Senate right now who largely share our values and are prioritizing environmental issues. I think it is worth noting that on many of our priorities, Governor Scott does not always agree with us, sometimes opposes some of our priority policies. So we typically are having to work really hard to try to get votes on our issues that are 2/3 of the chamber's vote in support. So, what it will take to override a veto should it come to that. So it means we need to work really hard to develop policies where we can get support for things that are pro-environment, pro-public health, all the things that are representing our values, but that where we can get support from everyone, from the progressives to moderates. And that can be a challenging dynamic that we need to navigate. So it's just worth noting. But we have laid the groundwork for years for many of the policies and issues at play. Lots of policy research, public education, legislative committee work in many cases, legislative commissions in some cases. So there's a lot of background work that's been done that really feeds into some of the progress we're seeing this year. One worth noting is we had supported the legislature's enactment of the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2020, including overriding a gubernatorial veto to help put that law in place. And of course, this bill created the Vermont Climate Council, which crafted the recently adopted Climate Action Plan. And this law means the state is finally legally on the hook to meet our climate pollution reduction targets by 2025, 2030, and beyond. And we have lots of policy guidance thanks to all the hard work that went into developing that plan. And importantly, we've really seen the conversation in the State House shift from not whether or not we should act on climate or people putting forward solutions that just fell wildly short of the scope and scale of what needs to be done, to finally having debates about real proposals that really are looking at how we transform transportation and heating in particular to clean and efficient energy solutions. So that's been really exciting to see. It's also worth noting we're doing this work as we see the ongoing impacts of the unprovoked war in Ukraine and the oil and gas industry war profiteering with jacked up oil and gas prices, which of course is impacting Vermonters and underscoring the need to transition to clean local energy sources. We're also operating in a year when we have unprecedented federal funding available to invest in climate action, clean water, conservation, and smart growth development. We also, of course, are in a context of our ongoing reckoning with racial, social, and economic justice issues that is helping shape the policies that we'll discuss today and lay the groundwork for the state's first comprehensive environmental justice policy you'll hear a little bit more about. We, of course, also are at a time of a housing crisis with a lack of available and affordable housing options and need to put forward thoughtful solutions that encourage smart growth development, and know that we're losing upwards of 14,000 acres of forest land a year. So we need policies to address that. Particularly these issues, we know that with climate migration, we're likely to see increased development pressure on our landscape. So getting these issues right now is so important. And critically, we have years, I think part of the reason we're seeing a lot of momentum and success and enthusiasm for the issues that we'll be talking about today is that we've had so many years of incredible grassroots advocacy from folks like you all and many fellow Vermonters. So lawmakers really know that people expect and demand to see action on these issues and that they show up and vote for them at election time. So, a lot of factors are really combining to make it a really important year with a lot of VCV and VNRC priorities at play. And, one of the most exciting is this potential for historic investments that we know it's going to take to really underpin the implementation of many of the policies and programs to transform our energy system, address climate change, and build more resilient communities. So I'm now excited to introduce our panelists. First, we're going to talk about clean water issues with John Groveman, VNRC's Policy and Water Program Director. Next, you'll hear about healthy forests and smart growth policies from Jamie Fidel, VNRC's Forest and Wildlife Program Director, and Katie Gallagher, VNRC's Sustainable Communities Program Director. And finally, you'll hear about climate investments and climate policies from Johanna Miller, VNRC's Energy and Climate Program Director, the VCAN coordinator, and a member of the Vermont Climate Council. So logistics-wise, please put questions in chat as we go. We'll keep track of them. We might be able to get to a couple, clarifying questions as we go, but in general, we will just collect the questions and do our best to get to as many of them as we can. At the end, we did build in a good amount of time for Q&A, so keep the questions coming. We also are going to spend a few minutes near the end talking about how we can make sure that we are engaging and giving you what you need to be effective citizen advocates for these issues that you care about. And we'll plan to have you out of here by 1 o'clock. So thank you so much again for joining. And I'm now going to hand it over to John Groveman.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And thanks everybody for joining today and taking time to do this. So I'm going to really quickly just
where the nukes are stored, where the actual bombs.
Could we just have everyone mute? Thank you.
So I'm going to run through the bills that have been introduced this year, what's in play, and then move on to our next presenters, because as Lauren said, there's a lot going on. So bills that are in play that made it through crossover, H466 is a bill that would address water withdrawals from surface waters. Most people are surprised to find out that Vermont does not have any program to either track comprehensively or address potential impacts of withdrawing water from streams, rivers, lakes, and ponds in Vermont. There are the only water withdrawals that we address in Vermont are for snowmaking, for ski areas, and for water supplies, but there are a lot of other surface water withdrawals, and this issue's become more pressing over the last 5 to 10 years as the impacts of climate change have set in, and we're seeing more periods of these extreme weather events of both drought and flood. But during the drought, we had a drought last summer in Vermont, and really low flows in most of the state. And so it's really important to get a handle on who's withdrawing water, how much, and to make sure that it's not adversely affecting water quality in fisheries. So that bill is it passed the House. It's in Senate Natural Resources and Energy, had a couple of hearings. It's getting a little pushback from certain users of water. Hopefully we could get it over the finish line, and certainly we could use your help to do that. S113, this is a bill that contains issues we worked on for now, I think, 5 years. This is a bill that basically helps victims of toxic pollution who have high level of toxics in their system, but haven't gotten a terrible disease yet, and they need medical testing or what's known as medical monitoring. This bill would allow people, victims of toxic pollution, to seek damages for medical monitoring before they contract the disease. There's a minority of states that allow this through the court system. Vermont is trying to put this into statute and make this a statutory remedy. We've gotten a lot of pushback from the industry, Over the years, this bill was twice vetoed by the governor. The language has been tweaked to address the governor's concerns, we believe. Passed the Senate unanimously. Yesterday passed out of House Judiciary unanimously. The bill's now been sent to House Commerce, and insurance industry people are raising concerns about the bill, but hopefully we'll get this over the finish line. Another important part of this bill is it allows the state to assume the manufacturers of chemicals, so the DuPonts, the 3Ms, the manufacturers that create chemicals like PFAS, which I'm sure you've all heard about, and the damage it could cause. You can sue the chemical manufacturers for the harm the chemicals they've put out into the world have caused. So really hopeful about those two bills. There are two bills that are not going to, didn't make it through crossover, but I just wanted to mention one would improve wetland protection in Vermont. The other would create a program to protect what we call riparian areas, the areas along streams and rivers, that the vegetated areas, they help to filter pollution, provide shading for fisheries. We hope to get hearings on these bills later in the session, build momentum and pursue these bills certainly next session. Really crucial to climate adaptation is to have these sort of protections for our wetlands and our water resources. So I just wanted to note that. And lastly, as Lauren mentioned, we've seen a significant amount of money flow through the federal government through it's called ARPA funding. It's basically the stimulus funding based on COVID relief that has come from Congress that allows us to have a historic level of investment in certain environmental programs, including water. So we're looking the target from last year in the legislature is $225 million for water investment. And the legislature, based on that House passed budget, is on target for that. The debate is, and this is something that you should follow, is how to spend that money. We have tremendous needs in terms of water pollution, as I'm sure you all know. We want the money targeted towards underserved Vermonters, communities like mobile home parks that have struggled with water supply and wastewater over the years, towns that have less resources to put in wastewater systems where they haven't been able to fix our problems with combined sewer overflow. The money that the governor is willing to spend money on all those things, but not as much as we would like to see. And they have more money going towards programs that we think would help developers and entities that could afford to basically pay their own way and should have an obligation to deal with water pollution. So that's kind of the debate. If you want to know more about it, like check out our website, contact me. But the good news is there's a lot of money coming in the system that helps solve problems. So that is my quick overview. And I turn it over to Katie and Jamie. Is that correct?
That is correct. So we've got Katie Gallagher, VNRC Sustainable Communities Director, and Jamie Fidel, VNRC's Forest and Wildlife Program Director.
Thanks, Lauren. So I'll kick it off, and I'm Katie Gallagher. I direct the Sustainable Communities Program, and then I'm going to hand it off to Jamie. So the Sustainable Communities Program focuses on promoting smart growth and preventing sprawl. And so the two bills that I want to talk about here, S234 and S226, both promote smart growth housing in some ways that are overlapping and in some different ways. But we want to see more housing in our downtowns and villages where people can have more transportation choices, which helps to limit our greenhouse gas emissions. And having housing in these areas also helps to take development pressure off of those areas where we don't want it in our working lands and forests. So a key part of our mission is to reduce the environmental impacts of development by promoting livable community centers that provide accessible and affordable housing options. And so while housing is an incredibly complex issue driven by many, many different factors, these two bills help to just start to chip away at this problem that we have generally. So I want to step back just for a second to explain a little bit about what both of these bills touch on, which is the state designation program. And there's a lot of detail here, so I'm just going to try and do this briefly and high level, but towns with a state designated downtown or village centers, or our historic compact centers, can go through an additional process to receive what is called a neighborhood development area. And if they get a neighborhood development area, then they can receive additional state incentives. And one of those incentives is an Act 250 exemption for priority housing projects. And these help to create additional affordable housing in smart growth areas. So VNRC does not see regulations as the only or the primary obstacle to housing production, nor is Act 250 the cause of our housing crisis. This is a nationwide crisis, but we do recognize that some of these regulatory processes can either be duplicative or an extra step. And so these two bills in part help to address the neighborhood development areas, trying to make them more accessible for certain municipalities that already have really sophisticated planning and zoning in place, so that we can make sure that we're putting housing in the places that we want, but only where there is adequate environmental protections already in place. So S234 passed out of the Senate at the end of last week. It kind of has two main pieces to it, but it would support smart growth housing development by making these state incentives more accessible, particularly for smaller towns. And it also addresses forests in a very comprehensive way. And so Jamie is going to talk more about that in a second. But we believe that it's really important to, for any bill really, that encourages housing development to also include provisions that protect forests and working lands in order to address both the need, again, for affordable housing, but also the pressure that this development and incoming residents will put on our forests and working lands. As we've seen, this is already happening through the COVID-19 and climate migration. So specifically, S234 provides greater flexibility and accessibility for designated downtowns and village centers to receive that neighborhood development area designation, while still ensuring that full development and environmental protection. And it also provides additional accommodation for development timelines. So thinking about, especially in this time of COVID, where development might be delayed due to supply chain issues, this is helping to ease that up a little bit. And it allows smaller towns to build those priority housing projects with greater units and density. S226 is expected to pass out in the Senate later this week, and it includes additional housing provisions. Again, there's some overlap between these two bills, but S226 is the more comprehensive housing bill. And so I'm not going to go through all of the different pieces in here, but some that are really positive include funding for manufactured home improvements and relocation, in part, thinking about this as an equity issue to address the fact that these residents are disproportionately impacted by flooding and climate events. This bill also includes funding for multi-agency coordination to more effectively and holistically support towns in smart growth planning. So bringing together different partners to touch on all the different pieces that go into this work at the same time. It includes funding for commercial property conversion. So this would help to improve housing creation in smart growth areas. Support for municipalities to update their bylaws to more effectively implement smart growth policies. So actually moving from that town plan process to your bylaws, and hopefully then action on the ground. And then finally also helps to expand the downtown and village tax credits, which is a really helpful incentive program, expanding that to include these neighborhood development areas, which again is just expanding that geographic range beyond the downtown and villages. So it's still a pretty small area, but we want to help provide those tax incentives in those smart growth locations where we want more housing. So I'll leave it there for now and pass it off to Jamie.
Great, thanks, Katie. So as Katie's already mentioned, S234 is a comprehensive Act 250 bill. And there's been a number of years now where the legislature has attempted to come out with a comprehensive approach to Act 250 reform, both looking at where we can find efficiencies in order to address housing needs in the state, but also look at some of the gaps that exist in the Act. And in particular, there's been now a 9-year effort in the Vermont legislature to add a criteria to Act 250 that would address encouraging good site design in our forest as we do develop out in our forests. And so really the way that it would work in S234 is to add a criteria that would try to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the impacts of development in forest blocks and habitat connectivity areas. And then there would be a rulemaking that would flesh out how you would minimize. So it's really driving how do we have good site design as we do large subdivisions or large scale development that's triggered by Act 250. How do we encourage good site design? There's also a mechanism in S234 that would review long roads that would penetrate into intact areas as a way to try and address the jurisdictional gaps right now in our rural lands where the majority of subdivisions don't trigger Act 250, and there's a growing concern that there is fragmenting type of development. And for those intrusions that would have the greatest impact, there's an interest in having some kind of mechanism to encourage, again, good site design and growth patterns as we do develop in our forests. There's also some provisions in S234 to help promote and maintain forest processing as a way to maintain working lands. And then some clarifications that we don't have time to go into today, but I think we've hit on some of the major provisions in the Act. Then there's a couple of other bills that do get at also how to maintain resilient landscape in Vermont with a focus on forests. One of them is H606. This is sort of similar to the 30 by 30 initiative that's was presented by the Biden administration to try and accelerate how do we get to a certain amount of land conservation in our nation in order to address both climate and biodiversity crises that we're seeing. 606 did pass the House strong vote, and it would help implement a recommendation in the Vermont Climate Action Plan by setting conservation goals for the state, specifically to conserve 30% of Vermont's land by 2030 and 50% by 2050. It's basically centered on the Agency of Natural Resources working with stakeholders to develop a conservation plan to meet these goals. So it would define what does conservation mean. I think there is an emphasis on trying to look at permanent conservation, like through easements, but other mechanisms. There are other important programs in the state. So the agency would look at the suite of programs that are available, take stock of how we're doing, develop a way to progress over time, and then articulate the recommendations and funding that would be needing to get there, with an emphasis on working with willing landowners. The approach here is not to have some kind of massive regulatory effect in the state, to say that there are willing landowners who want to conserve land. How do we get to these accelerated goals to maintain an intact and resilient landscape? Finally, H697 would create a new subcategory in our current use program called reserve forest land. This category would provide options for landowners to manage qualifying parcels to have a more of an old forest condition. So there wouldn't be a requirement necessarily to do harvesting in these qualifying areas. This would not be open to just any land. You'd have to qualify, meaning you'd have to have 30% of your land would have to have a certain amount of either sensitive features, steep slopes, or criteria that has been developed by the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation to allow it to go into this category. And the goal is really to try and have more lands represented as old forest in Vermont, as there's targets in an Agency of Natural Resources document called Vermont Conservation Design to get to 9% of our forest in old growth sort of condition. Right now, we only have 1. And so this is an option to try and get there. So happy to answer any specific questions on that when we get to the question and answers, but I'm gonna leave it at that, as I know we need to keep this moving. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie and Jamie, and some good questions coming in that we are tracking and we'll get to in a few minutes. I'm going to now turn it over to Johanna Miller, the Energy and Climate Program Director of VNRC.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks for everyone for joining us here today. You heard some really important work happening in partnership with lots of folks from others on my team. I'm going to dig a little bit more substantively into the climate mitigation, the hard pollution reduction components of our work, and of the climate action plan, as you are likely well aware. And thank you for those of us to those of you who helped, ensure Vermont enacted a Global Warming Solutions Act. We now have this very broad frame embedded in the Global Warming Solutions Act that requires Vermont to make progress on climate broadly, both in hard pollution reduction, but also in adaptation and resilience measures. And the requirement also importantly requires a focus on a just transition and centering equity in both better in process and in policy and program design. So the Global Warming Solutions Act is a really important frame, and on the heels of the initial climate action plan adopted in early December, I really want to give the legislature credit for taking the plan seriously and getting to work on a lot of the different things that you just heard in the resilience and adaptation space, but also in the climate mitigation and pollution reduction space. So quick high-level highlight of what's happening. There's a lot. H740 is the FY23 budget, also known sometimes as the big bill, and H736, the transportation bill, or otherwise known as the T-bill sometimes. Those are two of the must-passed bills of the legislature, and combined, I know there's a lot on the screen here, and we will follow up and share some of this detail with you, but combined, there's over $200 million embedded in those two bills that are focused on, importantly, a few things: $80 million in low and moderate income weatherization programs, $45 million to support lower income earning Vermonters in tightening up their homes and saving money and staying warmer and more comfortable in those weatherized homes, and $35 million to support moderate income Vermonters in weatherization services and programs so that we can stop hemorrhaging heat, wasting energy, and start saving money. So that's a massive investment in weatherization. There's also importantly $48 million for a new municipal energy efficiency and innovation program. I'm going to talk more about that because it's connected to the budget, but it's a standalone bill. Importantly, there's $20 million in the FY23 budget for home electrical system upgrades, helping Vermonters sort of ready for cleaner heating and transportation options, and really sinking those dollars into helping Vermonters, again, make the improvements that they need at their homes to electrify more things as we reduce our energy usage, but move towards more cleaner local renewable energy supplies. There's $5 million in there for a low-income heat pump hot water heater change-out program, otherwise known as Switch and Save. Heat pump hot water heaters are a really effective, cost-effective, and effective way to reduce carbon pollution. And this is a new program that would be established to really target lower income earning Vermonters and help them, invest in this very sort of climate beneficial water heating technology. Importantly, there is also dollars in the bill for the climate workforce that we're going to need to develop, train, retrain, and deploy to do the work that we need to do in the climate adaptation, resilience, and mitigation space. So over $5 million for climate workforce scholarships, loan reimbursements, and this really exciting program called Serve, Learn, and Earn that a variety of different partners, including Vermont Works for Women and Resource and Audubon Vermont and others have put together. That's a climate job training program. So really important commitments in the budget for workforce and for both like sort of the direct services and supports to Vermonters to save energy and transition to more renewable supplies. Also importantly, embedded in the budget, Again, this is through ARPA dollars and through some very strategic maneuvering in the House Appropriations Committee in particular. There's $40 million for electric vehicle incentives, for charging infrastructure, for more efficient vehicle incentives, so more fuel efficient vehicles, especially to serve lower income Vermonters, a commitment to continuing fare-free, zero fare transit, microtransit, bike and pedestrian investments, and more. So really deep commitment in the budget and through the T-bill to really making the transition to more clean, cost-effective, and carbon beneficial strategies. A few other big highlights is Municipal Energy Resilience Initiative bill. Again, $48 million to deliver technical assistance, municipal building efficiency assessments, and $40 million in direct grants to communities themselves, municipalities, to support them in weatherizing their buildings, becoming more energy efficient, and to looking at their heating systems and transitioning them to systems that are less reliant or not reliant, thankfully, on fossil fuels and are more, clean heating systems. So that's really an exciting program. And again, $40 million in direct grants with $5 million in to support contractors to come into communities and do an assessment of buildings to help identify the most strategic investments. And then importantly, over $2 million to support the regional planning commissions and supporting their communities, especially those without more capacity to do this work and avail themselves of these dollars to get off of fossil fuels and become more energy independent and more affordable. Importantly, there is also the clean heat standard. This was the top pollution recommendation of the Climate Action Plan. It is a big, new, complex program that will fundamentally transform the way, we ask our fuel providers to deliver heat to Vermonters. It could be, a transformative program. It needs to be developed well and right. It is extremely complex and nuanced. But fundamentally, it will, for the first time, obligate the fossil fuel heating delivery sector to participate and support Vermonters and their customers in reducing their reliance on the imported fossil fuels that are, warming our planet. So it's a really important, sort of mechanism to ensure that there is a stepped strategic way for fuel providers to transition their business models and to help customers get off of carbon intensive, price volatile fossil fuels. So again, this is a really important big bill, and they will deliver that by a requirement to deliver cleaner heat measures to their customers, whether that's through, first weatherization, importantly, reducing the energy we need. That'll give us about 25% of reduction in average in buildings. So we need to find other ways to help Vermonters stay warm through more cost-effective local renewable heating resources, whether that's cold climate heat pumps, advanced wood heat, potentially sustainable biofuels. So really big, important policy that is now in Senate Natural Resources and Energy, and they're focusing intensively on the clean heat standard for the next 2 weeks. So stay tuned for more information on that. And then certainly last but not least, overgirding all of this work is the exciting news that the Environmental Justice Bill S-148 passed out of the Senate on a 28-1 final vote on the bill. This bill S-148 again now moves to the House. This is a critical, long overdue state policy that would establish an overarching framework for how Vermont better serves historically overburdened and underserved Vermonters. It requires the development of fundamental definitions, some tools and some processes to ensure we are delivering in a better, more strategic way on our justice commitments. And again, it does things like define EJ populations. It requires the Agency of Natural Resources to create and then utilize a mapping tool to identify overburdened, underserved communities. It establishes an environmental justice advisory council and an interagency council to work with our state agencies to do this important work well. And importantly, it directs more targeted incentives to, again, historically overburdened and underserved Vermont communities who have for too long borne a disproportionate burden when it comes to environmental impacts, environmental harms, and not benefited as much from the environmental benefits and the clean energy transition as they need to. So this is a really important framework. And I'm going to sort of end there, but to say there's a ton going on. And I really want to thank everyone here who's partnered with us in exploring some of these big, complex issues, and will continue to work with us to ensure that we deliver on policies that really are climate beneficial, equitable, and put us on a path to sustainable, much needed, long overdue progress. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe we're getting lots of great questions. So we're now transitioning to Q&A. Let me get my screen so I can see as many of you as possible. So maybe while we are still in climate mitigation mode, Joey, I will ask some of the questions that have been coming in, and then we've got some great forest questions and got a good question for John. So let's just try to, let's see. So could you just speak in more detail? So a couple questions came in about what is renewable natural gas? What's the role of biofuels in this, and biomass? And just speaking about, that's obviously been a sticky issue in the clean heat standard, and just how you are thinking about it and the work that's being done to try to, I think, tighten up the bill to better define sustainability and some of the parameters. But if you could just dig into that, that's clearly an area of interest.
And I won't have all the time we're going to need to dig into it, but I would say these are really important questions and share some of the concerns that I hear in those questions. I would say when it comes to improving the bill, tightening it up, strengthening it, defining what we mean by sustainable biofuels and renewable natural gas, for example, will be, advanced gas or renewable natural gas would be important. When it comes to biofuels, as you probably are well aware, some of them are climate beneficial. When you compare it to fossil fuels, some of them are, on par, and some of them are incredibly detrimental. When you're looking at the sustainability, from cradle to grave, if you want to say, should we be advancing a policy that's going to drive the sort of, tilling and planting of limited farm and forest land, either in Vermont or beyond, that exacerbates, reliance on unsustainable biofuels? Absolutely not. So there's a need for parameters in the policy that put guardrails around biofuels, in particular, define what a sustainable biofuel is and is not, and importantly, pair that with a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions analysis for all fuels, so that we can look at the solutions that we need to keep Vermonters warm in this cold climate, again, because weatherization will probably get us about a quarter of the way there. How do we meet the 75% of the heating need through more clean heating resources? And certainly my hope that we can make those resources that are best for the planet and ultimately cost effective, like clean electricity options or cold climate heat pumps, we can deliver on those better in the bill. So we're really working on that with a lot of different partners, because we certainly don't want this to be, we want this to deliver on its climate benefits, equity outcomes, which I see a question in here. There are in the bill, importantly, the bill does focus on delivering a greater percentage of benefits to lower income and moderate income Vermonters, 16% requirement for lower income, 16% for moderate income. And we're going to continue to look at ways to strengthen the equity components of the clean heat standard as well.
Thank you. And obviously lots more to dig into there, but want to make sure that we get to some other questions. There were a couple on weatherization. Who would handle weatherization for moderate income homes? Is that the same as low income, like CVOEO? And is the weatherization money going to Efficiency Vermont, going directly to comprehensive weatherization projects?
So I described two buckets of weatherization dollars, 45 million to lower income Vermonters. Those dollars would go to and be deployed through the important community action agencies and the partners who have delivered on the low-income weatherization assistance program for decades. So essentially, long story short, both of these buckets of dollars, including the 35 million, will go to Efficiency Vermont, and through sort of their networks with certified energy efficiency contractors, and sort of fill the coffers of their incentive programs to deliver through their existing mechanisms, sort of, again, efficiency and weatherization services to more moderate income Vermonters. So these are it's just more dollars to the trusted partners who've delivered and who we need to work with to continue to deliver more cost-effective, needed weatherization and efficiency improvements for Vermonters. So yeah, they're going to long-standing, really critical partners.
Thank you. The last kind of bucket I saw was on the climate, and then we'll transition to some of the forest questions. Was asking about, can the governor be sued if his vetoes prevent achievement of goals set by the Global Warming Solutions Act?
The state of Vermont can be sued if we don't hit the statutorily required pollution reduction requirements. Their first one being a 26% reduction below 2005 levels by 2025. So we have a long way to go to sort of see if we can do that. That being said, if the climate action plan doesn't add up, and currently it fundamentally doesn't, because some of you may know the core transportation component of the climate action plan, which is a recommendation to join the multi-state transportation and climate initiative, the regional cap and invest program for the transportation sector, that sort of fell apart just a week or so before the initial climate action plan was developed. So the climate action plan doesn't add up because of the transportation gap. If the clean heat standard, which is again the primary prong, the primary recommendation of the climate action plan to begin to transform the heating sector, again, 34% of our emissions, if the climate action, if the legislature doesn't advance the clean heat standard, I think it sets us back, and I think it becomes a political question, and it potentially could catalyze, the Agency of Natural Resources to rule make and go through an administrative process to begin to make progress in the thermal and transportation sector so that we can deliver on the legally binding components of the climate action plan, or risk a lawsuit, which could then go to the courts to compel action. So the long and the short of it is there is a legal hammer, there's more work to do. And, I also think the long and short of it is the longer we wait, the more costly and consequential inaction becomes. So we need to figure out how to address some of the very valid concerns with the clean heat standard and others, but we need to begin to ratchet down our reliance on the dirty imported fossil fuels that are hemorrhaging our economy and wreaking havoc on the planet. So really look forward to hearing from you all about how we do that through the clean heat standard, or if you have other epiphanies about what we can do, welcome that input too.
Thank you. All right, I see Jamie's ready and eager for some forest questions. So one came in asking why this was related to the current use legislation, why only certain forests being allowed to participate in this new component of the current use program? It seems certain acreage is important, but why only steep or sensitive? And what is the point of requiring cutting?
Yeah, so I think there's been a suite of options that have been put on the table about how to address, the interest in expanding the current use program beyond harvesting options. Should mention right now, there is already the opportunity in the program for qualified nonprofits to manage land without the requirement to harvest. And there's also certain areas within current use that don't have to be harvested, called ecologically significant treatment areas. I think that where the legislature decided to go was what the administration was supporting, and the Commissioner of Forest, Parks and Recreation developed a plan that would try and, I think, balance the interest between maintaining a program that does have a forest management component based on the way that the program was set up, but also acknowledge and value the fact that old forest and passively managed forests have a role to play. So I think if they just opened the program up to a general category of enrollment, there would have been concerns about the fiscal impact to the state, that the state wouldn't be able to actually afford a program that just has open enrollment in it. And so I certainly understand the perspective that people have, that there should be opportunities to manage forest land in many diverse ways. That's something that VNRC supports, but I think this was the compromise that was developed in the legislature, working with the administration, that had enough support for the bill to actually advance with a strong vote and hopefully become law.
Thank you. There were a couple other questions just about kind of conservation and intersection with our climate action plan. And I just wondering if you could talk a little bit, Jamie, about kind of what showed up in the climate action plan on forest policy, and kind of this tension between developing forests and protecting forests for all the values they provide for climate resilience. So if you could just speak a little to that. Sounded like there was some interest.
Sure. Yeah. So the climate action plan does recognize that it would be in the state's best interest if we could have no net loss of our, intact sort of natural lands, including, I would assume, a certain percentage of our forests for the role that they play in storing carbon, sequestering carbon, and maintaining a resilient forest landscape. So the climate action plan does want to kind of investigate how that would work, and whether there need to be some prioritization within that of what we're talking if we have a no net loss policy. I think that 74% of our state is forested, and so I think it would be very hard to actually pass legislation saying we will not develop in our forests at all, even though we want to try, and what we really want to do is maintain them to the best of our ability and reduce the degree to which they're being fragmented and converted. So I think that's the approach then that you see in Act 250 is yes, how do we try and maintain the functions of our forest? Is there a concentrated development that could happen on the edges of forests while we maintain the overall integrity of our forests? So I think there's just a point of reality here that it's just, there's not going to be a policy at the end of the day that essentially, says we will never develop in forest again. But I think we do want to really tackle it. How do we do it well? And how do we try and hold on to our forests as best we can?
Thank you. And I think based on a lot of the comments and questions in the chat, we're all feeling the tension between what would be done in an ideal world and the challenges of working with our citizen legislature and getting progress on these issues at the kind of scale and timeline that we know needs to happen. I wanted to throw a question to John, which is, I think, a good transition also to, we wanted to talk for a few minutes about how we make sure that we are providing information for you all that's helpful, in what formats, and make sure that we're keeping you engaged. And so somebody had asked John, how can we help get attention on H543 and H542? So these are the wetlands and the riparian protection bills. So if you could take a stab at that, and then I think Sheldon had to step away for a minute, but then I think is going to help facilitate the conversation about more broadly, how do we build attention and momentum for doing the work that needs to be done. Thanks, John.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lauren. So, I mean, basically, the reason we had a hard time getting those issues, further up on the agenda is because, as you're hearing, there's so much going on. There's so many needs right now to act on all of these issues. And the legislature, as Lauren indicated at the outset, they realize this and they are taking action. Unfortunately, we have a citizen legislature that meets only from January to May, and they have a finite amount of capacity. And it really is disappointing, because certainly wetland protection, riparian protection, river corridor protection is crucial if we're going to be able to deal with the impacts of climate change in Vermont. So what you can do, though, practically at this stage of the session is the wetlands bill actually has a outside chance of getting some attention. So I would urge you to contact the members of the House Natural Resources Committee. You can look that up online, the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and ask them, to take up the bill. I don't have the I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's in the PowerPoint presentation. And we should put that in the chat before we end, because they could, the changes, that bill, we have broader support for that bill. It would create a policy of no net loss of wetlands, which would be an important step forward. And sadly, that bill was crafted in response to proposed changes to weaken wetland protections in what are known as the wetland rules that have been under review by the Agency of Natural Resources for a number of years now. And if we don't get some movement on that bill, I fear that there will be weakening of wetland protections in those rules, more exemptions for various impacts to wetlands. So that's what immediately you could do. And then, once the session is over, we're going to regroup, and we'll have a new biennium next year and push the riparian and river corridor protection issues and other issues, depending on how far we get this year. And I see the frustration in the chat as I'm looking at the questions. We need to act urgently, and we need to act boldly, but we need to also grab what we can in terms of making progress when we can make progress, given the system that we have. As I said, a citizen legislature that meets, basically from January to May. And so we have an opportunity to make really good progress and important progress this year, but we're not going to be done. We'll never be done. And we'll come back next year, and then we'll use other tools, not just legislative tools, to make policy changes. But so it's a long answer, but wetlands focus now. House Natural Resources Committee and Senate Natural Resources Committee members, ask them to take up the bill, and maybe we can get that taken up.
Thank you, John. And the last few minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Sheldon Goodwin from Vermont Conservation Voters. And, I'm seeing a lot of great comments and questions, and really how we change what is possible at the legislature is through citizen engagement and pressure and action. And so that's what we wanted to talk to you about, of how do we better engage you all and make sure that our voices are all pushing together so that we can actually demand the kind of change that we need. So Sheldon, take it away.
Thanks, Lauren. Before we close, we just wanted to do a couple polls just to gauge how folks feel like is the best way to communicate with you about these important issues, as well as any policy areas that we talked on today that you would want more information, more webinars, more content around that we can provide to you. Also in the chat, it would be great if you could comment about how you feel like we're doing with updating you about what's going on in the legislature, what would be helpful for you to be a better citizen advocate. So I'm going to launch the polls now. So you should see them. There are two questions, but basically just trying to gauge the best ways to communicate and connect with you as VNRC and VCV members, as well as the kind of areas of topics that you would want to learn more about. But yeah, so as people are answering those questions in the poll and providing feedback in the chat, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren for our conclusion.
Great. Okay, looks like stuff is starting to get active back at the State House. So our program directors are peeling off. So Sheldon, are we going to get some feedback now, or just, okay, so it's coming in. So yes, everybody could just do the poll if you can, and any additional thoughts just put in the chat. We want to try to figure out the best ways to keep you all updated, to gather your input. Obviously, these are all complicated issues, and pushing on this citizen legislature has so many challenges, but also great opportunities. So Great. I don't know if we're seeing any results coming in, Sheldon. Awesome. Okay, and thank you for putting some of the bill numbers in, and feel free to reach out. We can send you links to the bills and things like that. Text alerts for legislator calls are great. Great.
Lauren, while we're waiting for the results to come in, could I take 30 seconds just to add one thought to some of the chat that I've been seeing, and
Yeah.
understandably the frustration I think that people are feeling, that we need real concrete action, that we've got we're at an emergency level, and we understand, you know, the pressure that's on to try and deliver on strong environmental policy. I would just encourage people, like on the forest fragmentation criteria I mentioned that we've been trying to add to Act 250. It's been a 9-year campaign, and it's taking that long because there is opposition to doing that. And so while we could look to, you know, even more expansive policies, we need your help actually getting these important steps in place, which would have real impact on the ground and would actually advance us in a very progressive way. And the reason that we keep on working at it every year is because we believe in these policies, but we need your help. And every year they're under a lot of attack. And so just would ask folks to take stock of what can be accomplished with a number of these items, not asking you to not think of what else needs to be done. But, you know, it takes a lot of work just to advance a number of these policies we've been talking about and get them across the finish line.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, and Gail was asking a question about, you know, opposition, and I think that's a good point. I don't know that we always are clear, like who we're up against and what the opposition is doing to try to, you know, stop progress on the issues that we're working on. So that's a great flag to be more clear of, you know, what we're up against, so that the importance of all of us weighing in. Is there any summaries, Sheldon, that you want to share? And then I think we can just let everyone go.
Yeah,
Okay.
it seems like from the poll and some from the chat that folks are liking the noon webinars. So hopefully trying to continue to do those to keep you informed, as well as continuing to do email and action alerts that way. Though there was one interesting and potentially helpful comment about text alerts potentially. So thank you for that. And then in terms of policy areas, it seems like clean energy and climate action, of course, are some of the hottest issues right now. So folks wanting more information about that, as well as land use and smart growth as number 2. But that was very interesting and helpful. But I will hand it back over to you, Lauren.
Great. Well, we're capturing all this chat also for both the input on how we can stay in good touch and push together, and some of the good questions and issues you all raised as we get into the second half of the session. But just wanted to thank everyone again so much for taking time to join us. And I know many of you have joined many of our webinars, and we're so grateful for all that you do in your communities. It really does make all the difference. And we will be back with another webinar soon, so stay tuned for that, and take care.